I'm Amy Robinson, News Director at WCMU Public Media. It's good to have you here this evening. This is a discussion where we're going to focus on diabetes. In 2018, the last figures that I had seen available, more than 34 million Americans are affected by diabetes, and Native Americans have a prevalence far greater than the non-native population. And so tonight's discussion is going to take a deeper dive into why Native people are impacted so much by this condition and ideas that can help to correct it, help to address it. The way the evening is going to work is this. We're going to share a couple of video clips from the program Blood Sugar Rising, and that is a program offered on WCMU Public Television. Then we're going to be talking about the issues surrounding this. If you have a question or a comment, we ask you to join in the conversation using the chat button, or I'm sorry, the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Just type your question in and we will relay it to our panelists. So we're going to start with a video in just a minute, and then we're going to be talking for a few minutes to a doctor about this condition and what it means for people. And then we'll be bringing in a couple of people who work more in depth with Native communities to talk about their experiences as well. So we're going to start this evening by taking a look at a clip from Blood Sugar Rising.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Valerie Bluebird Jernigan. She's a member citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So please join me in welcoming her, Dr. Jernigan.
I'm Valerie Jernigan, and I'm an intervention scientist. So the interventions that I do are focused on improving the food environments of tribal communities and thereby improve diabetes. Diabetes is a story that's about access to food. It's a story that's about opportunities and a story that's about getting out of poverty and reducing all the risk factors that combine to create that storm of diabetes. You don't really have to look very far to see the relationship between cultural genocide and diabetes. The boarding schools took Native children away from their families. And in my grandma's case, they took her, cut her hair, reprimanded her for speaking Choctaw. They were intended to take Native people and to erase the nativeness from them and to make them white. The trauma that occurs as a result of that is well documented in terms of producing all kinds of negative health outcomes. Diabetes is the tip of the iceberg. Growing up, I did not have access to healthy foods. I was a kid who grew up eating what's called commodity foods. Commodity foods look different than other foods. It's just surplus foods. So some months we would have a lot of canned milk. We would have mashed potato flakes. So nothing is fresh, everything is packaged.
So back in the 1980s, the commodity program was a way to fill your family's tummies, and that's pretty much how a lot of people did it, not by choice, but rather out of necessity. If you didn't have enough dollars to make it through the month, you had to participate in that program just in order to get through the month.
At the time we were eating the commodity foods, we really had no idea that they were going to impact health. There was no sense at all that this is going to hurt us. My dad has type 2 diabetes, and he's had type 2 diabetes for 20 years.
Just give me a couple eggs scrambled with some sausage patties and hash browns. Grandma does sausage and hash browns?
Mm-hmm. Remember our aunt passed away because of diabetes. Of course, she lived a long, happy life, but still the diabetes, you know, she went blind because of diabetes. And that's what worries me, is that sometimes I feel great and sometimes I don't. And I'm sure it's all because, and my heart attack was because of diabetes. Half the Indians in Oklahoma are getting commodities. And if you look at the commodities, it's all so much carbohydrates. It's gotta affect your diabetes.
So this would be what a typical convenience store would look like. In this town, at least, one of the only places that you can actually shop for food. And our own research shows that people eat here multiple times a week for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's not healthy. I mean, if you can just think about it for a minute, eating the majority of your foods from a gas station, then you can kind of imagine how you might start to feel after doing that for long periods of time.
How close is the closest grocery store to here, do you know?
10 miles. To see a salad on a menu seems like a small thing, but it's actually a pretty big deal. And I think it's a step in the direction toward changing social norms. We objectively improved the overall quality of these stores, which was something really important to us because we could take that back to leadership and show them that not only did you not lose any revenue, but in some months you actually gained revenue and your stores got objectively healthier.
We can't think about diabetes without taking that broader approach. That's what I want to see in my lifetime. That's what I hope I can see in my work.
You know, when I saw that video, I just thought it was very powerful in conveying the idea of how food can harm you. And that's one of the things we're talking about today. So this is, as we said, a particular problem in Native communities, but what we want to do first is we're bringing in Dr. Sethu Reddy. He's a professor and chair of medicine at Central Michigan University. Dr. Reddy, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to talk to you about the issue of diabetes writ large so we can kind of understand a little bit more about this condition. Talk about type 2 diabetes. Give us a sense for what it is and kind of where it comes from. What are the causes?
Sure. Thank you, Amy. And the video was certainly very powerful and teaches the lesson that the environment in which we live in is probably very critical in terms of the prevalence of diabetes. So we know that diabetes basically means elevated blood sugar. There are many causes, but the most frequent cause, 85% of diabetes in the US is type 2 diabetes, and that's the most common. Very strong family history, usually associated with what we call insulin resistance. So your pancreas makes lots of insulin, but the body doesn't respond as well. And just like anything else, you know, if you're it's like whipping a dying horse, the pancreas can keep up for a certain time, but after 15, 20 years, the pancreas starts giving up, and that's when the blood sugars start rising. And the Native American community, or in Canada, I used to know them as the First Nations people. The prevalence is much higher than the general Caucasian European population. The Pima Indians in Southwest Arizona, right now the prevalence in adults is about 50%. So 1 out of 2 adults has type 2 diabetes. We always talk about genetics versus environment. There is a very strong family influence and genetic influence, but the reality is that our genes are the same today as our forefathers 5,000 years ago. Not much has changed. So we're the same people, but yet the diabetes has just exploded in the last 100 years. The video you showed some old pictures, but if we can go back to look at some of the historical paintings of Native American people, they all were like marathon runners, extremely fit, just in top shape. Any one of them probably could have been an Olympic athlete. Just take them out of their town or village, and so that's relatively recently, like 150, 200 years ago. And now, of course, with the food habits, exercise habits, it's changed quite dramatically. In the
So when we
U.S.,
look at causes of type 2 diabetes, is it a largely exercise and diet? Is it largely kind of physical activity and what we eat is contributing to this epidemic?
it's definitely both. If you go back to the original Native American diet, was actually rich in fat and bone marrow and animal meat and so on. But they were extremely fit. They were exercising every day. They were looking for the food, and they did not have this access to food in refrigerators and the corner gas station, for example.
And we're going to dig a little deeper into that history in just a few minutes, but let me ask you before we do, what are some of the complications that can arise when a person has diabetes?
So sadly, unlike arthritis, where you have problem with the joints and that's all you have, let's say, it doesn't go to other places in the body. Blood sugar, however, circulates throughout the whole body. So the complications we get can affect almost every organ in our body. The classic ones, of course, are the eyes, heart, kidneys, and nerves, blood circulation in the legs and to the brain. These are the classic ones. But I can honestly tell you that diabetes affects the stomach, the eyes, the lungs, every organ, basically. And so the complications typically occur about 15 to 20 years after the onset of diabetes. And one thing I wanted to stress is that I think you may discuss this later on during this evening. So when we develop diabetes 10, 20 years sooner than our parents or our grandparents, that's what's happening. Diabetes is occurring at a younger age. I'm a strong believer that grandparents are crucial to one's culture, maintaining the culture and the family history and the family traditions. So you can imagine if you have diabetes at age 30 and you have a heart attack at age 45, the grandchildren are not going to see the grandparents. So I think this is even beyond a medical effect, it's going to have an impact on the culture of the whole group of people.
Now, Dr. Reddy, we're going to bring a couple other panelists in, and we were thinking you would join us for the first part of the program, but are you available to stick around longer through the hour?
Yes, I can stay until 8. And,
Good. Let's have you sit tight, and I'd like to bring in our other panelists now. So I'm going to introduce them when I see them pop up, and that I'm sure they're coming right now. And let's leave Dr. Reddy up as well. And thank you, Melissa Walls. I see you there. Hi, thanks for joining us. You're still muted at the moment, but Melissa Walls is director of the Great Lakes Hub for the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health. And so this is one of the small silver linings of COVID, is jumping into the virtual world allows us to reach out to people who aren't in our backyard. And we appreciate you being here, Melissa. Thanks for joining us. And Regina Brubacker-Carver, a registered nurse, is a health educator with the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians in Traverse City. So Regina, thank you for joining us as well. Now we want to dig a little deeper into this issue of diabetes, and so let's take a few minutes and explore that problem. And Melissa, I'm going to start with you. Now, Dr. Reddy was certainly getting into it, but how would you put a frame around this problem of diabetes in the Native American community?
Well, Amy, first I'd just like to say Buju Memengwan Indishinakaz. So I'm Melissa Walls, as you mentioned, but I wanted to just share my Anishinaabe name. So I'm a member of the Anishinaabe community, which is here in Minnesota. So while I work for Johns Hopkins, which is in Baltimore, I live in, breathe here in Minnesota, so not too far away from you. So to your point, though, the issue of diabetes, I mean, Dr. Reddy, you hit the nail on the head with regards to prevalence, but I want to really take one point a bit further, which is there are, nearly 600 tribes federally recognized in the United States, many more tribes that are not federally recognized. And the prevalence of type 2 diabetes varies dramatically across these communities. So Pima Indians, which Dr. Reddy mentioned, are known for having extremely high prevalence rates. And then other groups many of us have high rates. Overall, it's about double the rate of the general population, but this varies substantially depending on a lot of things, including what Valerie talked about in that video, which is experiences with colonization and how much communities have or have not retained connections to culture and cultural ways, actually. So prevalence is one thing, but then the reality and the lived experience of it is quite another. And Dr. Reddy, you mentioned our grandparents. My great-grandfather died due to complications related to type 2 diabetes. He lived the last 5 years or so of his life without one of his legs. My uncle, his son, lived the same way, died in similar ways. Everyone in my maternal family has type 2 diabetes. I am bound and determined not to join that story. And it's devastating. The impacts are not just in those numbers, but in the years of life lost and the life that you have that is spent suffering, which is really hard to put into words. Statistics don't cover it.
Well, and I'd like to bring Regina into the conversation because Regina, you work with your tribal members on health and nutrition diet issues. And so living up in Northern Michigan, what are you seeing in your tribe in regards to the impact of diabetes?
First off, Buju, Aging Carver and Dijnikas, Waganakasing, Odawa and Dow, Makwa and Dodam, Conwaying and Donjaba. Introducing myself to you in my mother's people's language. My name is Regina Brubacker-Carver. I live in the land of the crooked tree and I'm in Bear Clan. Culture is very important to us, and the language is one of the ways that we share that culture. So locally, if you live in Indian country, you deal with diabetes. Many of our educational programs are aimed at reaching out to people with diabetes or diabetes prevention. It's not easy to reach people because there's a good degree of fatalism, and I don't believe that our tribe is alone in that. That tribal members will tell you, my parents had diabetes, my grandparents had diabetes, I'm going to get diabetes. There's no point in fighting it, and that's a really tough hill to climb.
Dr. Reddy, let me ask you. When you work with people as a physician, what kind of things can you say or do to get through to them? I mean, if you're working with a patient who has this sense of fatalism, what kind of messaging do you think can help move this conversation forward?
Yeah, I think we have to personalize our approach. Gone are the days where, the doctor speaks from the high up on high and say, "Thou must do this, thou must do that." That doesn't work. And I've had many patients when I was younger. They'd say, "Yes, doctor." "No, doctor." "Yes, doctor. I'll do that, doctor." "Thank you very much, doctor." They go home. They didn't do anything what I told them. So I've kind of gone back and learned new ways of discussing with our patients. And again, we like to call them people with diabetes rather than patients with diabetes, because we realize that every one of them has a family, individual, their own aspirations and so on. So I try to find what makes them tick. So typically I'll ask, do they have grandchildren? Do they want to see their grandchildren grow up and get married? Often our folks are more interested in staying healthy for other people rather than for themselves. I've seen many wives not look after themselves, but they'll do anything to help their children or a spouse, etc. So you have to find what motivates and try not to speak too much scientific medical lingo. I think you have to put it in their language. And surgeon professor I knew many years ago said each person only has a limited amount of BMU, behavioral modification units. So I used to typically say, oh, you've got 10 things that you need to improve: your diet, your carbohydrate, exercise, quitting smoking, all the other things that we prescribe. And most people can't handle, it's overwhelming. So we try and dial it back and say, listen, let's try to work on maybe the carbohydrates this next few months. Next time we'll talk about exercise. So we'll go in stepwise fashion to try not to overwhelm the patient. And then this is a war, it's not a battle. So it's not like a short-term gain. So we're in it for the long haul. And people do fall off the wagon occasionally, and we have to accept that and it's reality, but help them get them back up.
Let's get into the history of the diabetes problem with Native Americans. When I first began looking at this, and I was told, you know, there's this diet issue, there's this history that's steeped in dietary changes that came about suddenly, as well as past trauma. I thought, well, is there more to it? And it turns out, as I've spoken to you over the phone, that is a big piece of it. So Melissa, I'm going to come back to you, and so first of all, I want to start with a few numbers for our viewers. So it was in 1835, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and that initiated relocation by the thousands of Native Americans. By the mid-1870s, many people, Native people, were on reservations or beginning to certainly move to reservations. And by late 1878, many Indian children were being relocated to boarding schools and away from reservations. So just shock after shock to the Native American system and way of life. But you know, those are just numbers on a timeline without the proper context. So Melissa, can you give us a sense to put a heart to it, to put a face to it, on how this impacted Native people, these changes, and how it played into the diabetes issue?
Sure, I can give it a shot. So I think two things. One is, before I dive into the history, this issue of fatalism and even the issue of the inequity that type 2 diabetes is for Native communities is a product of the environment, not the individual. So I really think we ask physicians like Dr. Reddy way too much, and we probably put the problem in the wrong, or the solution in the wrong bucket when we try to think of individual interventions that are going to remedy this situation that we're in. We know that these issues are largely socially determined, and we know, as we've talked about already, that in the last 100+ years, even within the last 100 years though, there have been massive nutrition transitions. There have been massive assaults to our cultural lifeways. It wasn't until the 1970s that Indian quote unquote religious practices, so ceremonies, what have you, were finally not illegal anymore. And so to reclaim and redress those things is going to take time. But the truth is, each one of those assaults that you brought up on that timeline, and many that followed afterwards, and the ongoing oppression we see today, are deeply, deeply painful. I can give you one small example, small but huge for our family. In our area, and also probably in Michigan, Anishinaabe people came here because the prophecy was, come to the place where the food grows on the water, and that food is monomen, or wild rice. And so in my family, which happened to settle right on the border of what is now Minnesota and Canada, there is a lake called Rainy Lake, where for centuries my family gathered this monomen, this critical food that really sustains us and is so healthy. In the 1970s, the National Park Service decided to put Voyageurs National Park on those waters, and guess what happened that year? My uncles went ricing and they got arrested for doing this traditional practice. that creates, even when I say it out loud to you, it creates such a sense of injustice within my blood, within my being. And that's just one small example. It's not the example of my great grandfather or Valerie's grandmother being sent to a boarding school where you are literally not able to see your family. In my grandfather's case, he could see across the way because the reserve he lived on was where the boarding school was. He could see where his family lived, but he couldn't get to them. He wasn't able to speak his traditional language. He didn't learn his cultural ways. He became a Catholic. The list goes on and on. The pain and the loss, and also on the flip side, the sense of survivance and activism that generates in Native peoples is so deep and so resonating that we could go for hours just talking about historical trauma and historical resilience.
Regina, let me ask you to drill down a little bit into the food piece itself. There were, as well as the traumas that occurred, which in and of itself would be enough to, throw a culture off for generations. Hand in glove with that were changes to the diet that came and were just devastating. Explain that a little bit to us.
Well, in Michigan, we had it pretty good up until the 1870s, when the railroad trains came north and they started bringing people to this area because of the rich natural resources. So gradually, over time, we lost a lot of our hunting places, our places where we would go and gather traditional foods, materials to do our traditional crafts, our baskets, our blankets, our reeds, all of these things were lost to us. And because of historical microaggressions that happened, we couldn't speak up, because if we spoke up, the government would notice us, and then we were more likely to be moved. So in this area, we chose to live with it. So when you lose those historical food sources, what do you do? We too had access to commodity foods, and what we could afford to buy that was cheap. So instead of the wild rice, which we also have a wild rice story, if I can segue for just a minute, I never thought that we were a wild rice society because there is so little wild rice grown in Michigan. But when you look into the history of it, there were hundreds of millions of acres of lakes and rivers that grew wild rice, that were torn out, that were dammed up, that were drained to make way for resorters. Lakes were turned into farming areas, so they could grow corn or wheat or soy. And we had to supplement with what we could get, which was mostly potatoes and things like that. So if you look at the nutritional value of a cup of potato compared to a cup of wild rice, there is no comparison. The wild rice has vitamins and minerals that's lacking. It has fiber, it has protein. It's good for us, and we lost a lot of that. So
you lost the wild rice, you lost the nuts and berries, you lost the game, the lean game that you used to hunt, and you lost the ability to really travel, as a Native people, the way you would travel and forage and hunt. And instead you got reservations and commodities and fry bread and alcohol.
Mhm.
We were talking about that before this panel. I mean, again, that goes to kind of this simple sugar, the food that you use because it's what you have, but it only harms you in the end.
Mm-hmm. That's just so true. I really don't know what else to say about that. That we even our fishing rights, like with the ceremonial rights, where we had no legal right to practice our religion. We also had to fight tooth and nail in the courts for our rights to fish. We fished the Great Lakes for hundreds of years since we've been here. But even in the 70s, the DNR would, they would treat our fishermen terribly. I mean, it was a war out on the Great Lakes, and not too many people realize that. So one of the rights that we fight for now as a tribe is to keep those fishing rights.
Dr. Reddy, you had talked about the balance between nature and nurture, if you will, environment and genetics. And so we have a group of people who had been living one way for millennia, and now there's a sudden dramatic change in their diet. Explain how that impact is just so significant, because so many other people might eat a similar diet and not have the same results, at least in the same time frame.
Right. So both the genetics is important as well. So I'm from East India originally. I'm at a much higher risk than somebody from Sweden or Norway, for example, if we ate the same food. So the nurture part is interesting. Melissa talked about the Pima Indians. There's actually Pima Indians, migrated to Arizona, but some of the Pima Indians kept going south. They actually went to Mexico and were living in a high mountainous area, sealed off from the general society by nothing other than a drawbridge. So we have the same genetics, same people, and the diabetes in the Pima Indians in Mexico is almost zero. They're very fit, they're active, they eat a traditional Native American diet, which is quite different from the reservations and so on that in Arizona, I think they're having. So it does tell you that genetics, family history is very important, but there's a lot in our control, which is the optimistic side of us, right? So we have to think, okay, when children are in middle school, how do we make sure they're going to learn healthy habits with exercise and nutrition, preventing obesity? We know that if you look at the trend of obesity, obesity prevalence precedes diabetes by about 10 to 15 years. So that's what's going to happen. So if you say genetics, then it becomes fatalistic, saying, woe is me, I'm going to get diabetes. But on the other hand, there's a lot we can do and many of it's lifestyle. It's not medications, it's not expensive things, but really it's simpler, but it's also very tough to do the lifestyle changes.
They are hard, and that's what we're going to talk about next, because I know this is an issue, and many people are working on returning to a cultural or native diet in order to help American Indians shake this horrible curse of diabetes. What I want to do first is to take another quick look at a video clip from the Blood Sugar Rising program. And this is an individual who is not, she's not Native American. I believe she maybe has a Filipino background. But listen to this clip, and again, it kind of ties in with how culture ties in with this illness.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Kargahl. I'm a Youth Speaks alum. I'm now a poet mentor for the organization, and so I just feel real blessed to be in the building. My mother's side has diabetes. Diabetes is more and more a curse that we thought we brought to ourselves. We try to break it with a spell, a potion, and a ritual. What is insulin but a potion? What is a spell but a diagnosis? We take a tiny needle and prick our finger. What is a blood sacrifice to a blood test? I moved to America in 2001. This is like peak early 2000s, second grade Halloween. Trick-or-treating was like a brand new experience for me, which was like, oh yeah, you're gonna go around and people are gonna be free candy. And I was like, what? As a 7-year-old coming from a third world country and getting free candy, I was like, yo, I'm so down for America right now. Like, this is tight. Diabetes runs in my family through my mother's side. Her mother had it, her sister had it as well, and then my mother has it too. And now my older sister has it as well. So the Bigger Picture project is a collaboration between Youth Speaks and Dr. Dean Schillinger, in which we do workshops based around health and food accessibility with our young folks with poetry. So it sounds a little like disconnected, but it's really crazy how connected it is. Your relationship with health is also your relationship with your community. Your relationship with health is also your relationship with your family and with your body.
So try to jot down any like last minute stuff you're thinking of. For raise your hands in here, how many people in here know somebody with type 2 diabetes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of 8. That's like what, 90+% of the room, right? That's wild.
How does this impact children and young people in a daily sense? Like, does it create other health issues? Does it like affect their lifespan? Like,
we've discovered that type 2 diabetes in a young person is more aggressive than in an older person. It's insidious and slow, progressive, so it's nasty stuff.
So gonna transition to like 10 minutes of writing.
So what do you reach for when you're hungry, and or what reaches for you?
Wow.
Yeah.
Anyone like to share? Bless us with some words.
Okay, you guys are staring at me. I want to be able to eat without second guessing, without thinking about a smaller version of myself, without thinking about food as a weapon or a setback. I want to be able to be hungry and eat without feeling like I'm killing myself. My body is a landmine of insecurities, my bloodline a generation of curses, a system that nobody has been able to break. When I'm hungry, I think about the bodies of women in my life and serving and eating last.
I really liked the line when you said food as a weapon. What did that mean to you?
Yeah, like all the intersections of my identity are what, like, food is a weapon. As a Filipino and somebody from the East Bay who doesn't have that access, that's like a direct threat. But it's hard to grasp, like, what does that violence look like? And it's like, it looks like my whole family having diabetes and my mom having glaucoma because of her high blood sugar. And like, it looks like this and this and this, you know? But it's like, for people who don't go through that and don't have, it's like, it's not even that bad. All you have to do is like, do those minuscule choices when it's like you literally don't have those choices sometimes. Filipino food is like so good, but it's also like, yeah, just a mix of a lot of like different struggles that we've been through. I think my family avoids talking about diabetes because they know it's a problem that they have to address. A cycle of not being concerned about your health. Like, I think that's a big cycle in my family. These things could be inevitable, but there are other things that are also preventable. When I think about like ending the cycle of diabetes, it's always gonna be my family.
So I want to take the last 15 minutes or so of this program and really drill down into the solutions, things that people can do to help address this problem. And so I guess I'm gonna start, Regina, if someone goes to their pantry, if a Native person, any person, but we're going to be talking Native Americans, obviously, goes to their pantry and looks in it, what are the foods, what does it look like if it's going to, you know, the red flags that are going to be created by the foods in that pantry? What are the problem foods?
Processed, highly processed foods are the worst for all of us. And they're hard to avoid. Just because of the way society has become. It's so much easier to grab a box of Rice Krispies off the shelf and make yourself a bowl of cereal in the morning than it is to cook a whole steel cut oat breakfast or whole grain muffins, whatever. You know, it's just so much easier and quicker, and everything happens so fast now that people don't take the time to really cook and enjoy food. So highly processed, and at the risk of sounding biased, the white foods. things that have had the nutrition stripped from them to make them last longer on the shelf, to make them more pleasing to the eye, or what have you. Those are the worst things. The sugar, there's sugar in everything, everywhere. And that's not good for any of us.
The one that comes to mind, you speak so highly of wild rice. So if you take the wild rice compared to white rice, when you talk about the white foods, that's kind of what comes to my mind.
Yes.
Now you're working in your tribe to kind of bring back the Anishinaabe diet to the cultural or traditional diet that your people used to eat. Give us a sense for that movement, for that effort that you're working on right now.
Okay. To walk that back a little bit, I think it's more to raise awareness of what a culturally appropriate diet looks like, because we're so far removed from that like we discussed earlier, fry bread is considered a traditional food when fry bread is literally the enemy at the gate. Dr. Martin Reinhardt at NMU, bless his work, came up with a decolonizing diet project, which was a game changer for me. So for a year and a half, they studied people who committed to eat at least 25% of their diet from foods that were available to northern Michiganders before European civilization came here. So they would go out on group gatherings and collect all of these foods that we don't even look at as foods anymore. A lot of them are considered weeds. But as a result of that study, they found that diabetes rates dropped, blood cholesterol dropped, blood pressure dropped, everybody lost weight, and they regained a sense of community that had been lacking. So it's really intensive program to do something like that. So our goal is not maybe to get people wholly involved in it, but to raise awareness that this is out there, that it's possible to eat more of those foods, and just making small changes can help. So we've done cooking classes where we would feature a few recipes from the Decolonizing Diet Project cookbook. We would, at one point we did a Indigi Chopped, we called it, which was an indigenous version of the Chopped cooking contest. So we gave people a list of foods that they had to use, and we gave them each a copy of the cookbook, and they had to come up with their own recipes, and then they brought it back and we had a tasting. So we had some of our tribal chefs as the judges panel, and they, you know, they tasted the food and made their notes, and then we declared the winner. So that was just a fun way to make people aware that this is out there. I think that's mostly it. I know it used to be called the commodities program, the food distribution. I can remember the food distribution program on Indian reservations. They have been doing a fine job bringing traditional or cultural foods into the program. So the commodities program has come a long ways from what it was, but there's such a stigma to it that a lot of people would prefer to take their money in the form of a bridge card or take part in the standard food programs instead of the tribal program, which is phenomenal. And I almost wish I made a low enough salary that I could qualify.
Melissa, let me ask you, what are you seeing along this traditional cultural food education / movement in your tribe and in your region of the country?
Very, very similar to what Regina's saying. So I know about the decolonizing diet movement, decolonizing food systems. There's pushes for food sovereignty to create food sovereign reservations where we rely on ourselves to create and generate our own foods for our families and our elders. There's a couple of things also that we're doing as part of our research. So the stories that we've talked about tonight are really kind of like a timeline of my journey as a researcher in collaboration with communities, which started hearing a special diabetes nurse at the Boys Fort Band of Ojibwe, which is where I grew up getting care, telling me that, oh, you know, my patients, they'll take their medication, they'll take that insulin, but oh man, there's just like, I can't get people to exercise. I can't, the stuff we talked about here. And so we launched what has now turned into about 15 years of research, where we really tried to get at the root causes of this epidemic. And of course, the issues of historical trauma, ongoing poverty and marginalization, they were, right at the base of all the causes. We've talked about that. Layered on top of that were things like encountering stressors and trauma and, things that happen across generations of families, and, learning unhealthy behaviors and how that all kind of is rooted in those anchors. And the antidote to these across multiple studies that I've been involved with, and studies that I've read and reviewed for other Native researchers and researchers working with Native communities, culture and community are the two most robust predictors of positive outcomes for any health condition that I've ever encountered in Native communities. But what does that mean? So Regina's talking about this, right? It can mean a lot of things. It could mean diet. It could mean promoting traditional cultural involvement. It could be promoting language. There's lots of ways we can do this, and tribes are doing this. I mean, all tribes are engaged in cultural revitalization. So from our team, I work with a center that has offices across the country, and we learned about a project, a diabetes preventive intervention that was developed in the southwestern US with White Mountain Apache and Navajo Nation. And it was a program that was really targeting kids, trying to get them to engage with culture, learn about diet, learn about health, learn about how to read a nutrition label, doing it all in a very culturally centered way, and promoting involvement with their parents or their adult caregiver. It could have been a grandma, auntie, uncle, whomever. And through tracking outcomes with these kiddos who, had great outcomes in terms of reductions in weight, improvements in psychological health, it was a very holistic program. A happy consequence that wasn't expected was these parents who were just involved as support people for their kids started losing weight. And so this thing that I'm hearing people talking about tonight, this leveraging family as your motivational tool, is very cultural for all humans, but especially for Indigenous peoples, I think. This idea that we look forward in our case, 3 generations, and look back in 3 generations, and we are 1 generation, that's 7 generations of thought. And if you can kind of leverage all of that for behavior change, you might have some good outcomes, which that program seemed to indicate. So we're getting ready to launch. We hope to have launched it last summer, but then this thing happened called the pandemic. A multi-site trial of a family-based, culturally embedded 14-week, or 14-session, I should say, curriculum in which family health coaches from communities who work with clinics or work with nurses like Regina go into homes within the reservations or very close to reservations, offer as communities, and work with family units, because it's hard enough to change on your own, but it's super hard if you're trying to change and then mom or dad or brother or sister brings in, like you said, the Rice Krispie treats or whatever. You all know, we've all experienced this kind of sabotage to our attempts at healthy living, especially this time of year. So we're trying to leverage the family unit and also promote engagement and cultural activities outside the home. So really trying to advertise and work with tribal nations to bump up cultural activities. And then of course, all the other ingredients that go into behavior change that are evidence-based, things like learning about what is healthy, how to read the nutrition label, what does exercise mean, how do I understand what diabetes even is. All of that matters too, as does learning about how your mental health impacts diabetes, how historical trauma led to the onset of the disease in the first place, how connecting to culture and community can be a healing catalyst. So about 2 years from now, I can tell you what the outcomes of that study are, but we're hoping to generate some pretty robust evidence so that the program can be rolled out for other tribal nations to use.
Wonderful, wonderful. To our audience, if you have questions, please add them to the question answer box at the bottom of the Zoom page. Also, a recording of this panel will be available tomorrow at our website, wcmu.org, and then go to /diabetes. Dr. Reddy, so we've heard some of the research from Melissa and what Regina has observed and read and done and seen herself. So if we can get people to start eating healthier, to maybe return to a more traditional cultural Anishinaabe diet, what kind of impacts can we realistically expect big picture?
I think it'd be phenomenal. We're talking about diabetes today, but the benefits are going to go beyond diabetes. Heart disease, mental health, fitness, less arthritis, etc. I think you're going to see a whole host of benefits. And I congratulate Melissa and Regina for their projects and their thoughts. At CMU, we're actually looking at impact of adverse childhood experiences. So even beyond all the trauma that people have experienced, generations ago, which is still the remnants are being felt now. Even this generation of children, if they're living in an adverse environment, it's been found that leads to hardwiring of the brain in terms of, a well-adjusted child will respond to stress by doing something healthy or getting advice from a parent or a grandparent. But a child that's had adverse experiences may respond by moving to improper diet, exercise, drug addiction, etc. So not only diabetes, but drug addiction, alcohol, etc., has been linked to these adverse childhood experiences. So I would just emphasize what Melissa has said, actually, which is that this all starts in childhood. So it's very difficult to change the way the Titanic is going down the ocean because it's a huge ocean liner, and that's what an adult is. However, when we are children, it's a lot easier to mold the right habits, the right culture, and they are more likely to continue that practice as they get older. So it's hard to do, but I think middle school, actually, around the time of puberty, is when most of the weight gain and things like that happen. So either late elementary school or middle school would be a prime time to instill good habits. And the dietary things that Regina talked about is not just for Native American. It applies to everybody in North America. We should stay away from processed foods or refined foods, so it is a public health problem, and we need to think of a public health strategy as opposed to individual drug treatment and things like that.
We need to wrap it up. We have about 5 minutes left, but I want to have each of you, kind of share a final thought with me. And what I'm wondering is, so for people who are watching this evening and have an interest in maybe, I'm going to stop myself because we did have a question come in, and I do want to get to them when we can. So this question coming from Jay Powers: could you address diabetes and metabolic. Thank you. Metabolic syndrome. I had a blank. Metabolic syndrome. How do you overcome metabolic syndrome?
Yeah, so very quickly, metabolic syndrome is like a precursor to diabetes. And it's associated with most of the weight being in the middle of the body, but also associated with polycystic ovary disease in women, premature heart disease in both men and women, sleep apnea more likely to happen. So the good news is the treatment is same as trying to prevent diabetes. Exercise, better nutrition, controlling one's weight, etc. So so metabolic syndrome is a special kind of central obesity, which is a precursor to predicting diabetes.
Now I'd like to just end with a thought from each of you as people are watching tonight and thinking, I'd like to do something. I'd like to take some action. I'd like to start on a healthier path. And maybe they aren't going to pick up the books that you've mentioned, and they're interested right now. They're with us now, so let's get the message to them now. What are your final thoughts on one or two things that people can do to kind of move forward if they're concerned about diabetes or kind of just healthy living? Dr. Reddy, we'll start with you. What would you suggest?
Certainly, we should walk how we talk, I guess. So walk the talk. So I'm trying to be more noticing of what I eat and how much exercise I do. So it's easier to talk to our patients. We also need to leverage maybe modern technology to bring back the old traditional cultures, etc. So I'm just thinking out loud here because you raised the question. But imagine if you had a Native American app for where to find the foods, where can you get them, how recipes, etc. There are lots of things there now that we can engage our children and young people today, and use the Western technology, so to speak, but to improve our health. And it's a long road. It's I just said it at the beginning. This is not something where you do it for a month and you get a pat on the back and a medal. That's not. It's a lifelong challenge, and that's why it has to be started in our youth.
Regina, what are your final thoughts this evening?
To take it down to its simplest answer, I read somewhere that if you want to avoid diabetes, you eat as though you have diabetes. So all of those things we talked about, avoid simple sugars, count your carbohydrates, eat a balanced diet. There's a lot of information out there. If you look at the MyPlate plan, which is online anywhere, you can get a really good idea of what a healthy plate should look like. And just walk, make a commitment. If you don't walk at all, start a walking program where you walk in your driveway a couple times a day. Or if you're in northern Michigan or Minnesota and you're getting to that time of year, house walking, just walk back and forth in your house. And if you take 2 laps the first week, next week add 3 laps. And it takes just a little bit of commitment to see results. And in 6 months, you could see major changes, as opposed to in 6 months, if you did nothing, where would you be?
All right, very good, thank you. And Melissa, your final thoughts.
Sure. Well, I think of things in multiple levels. So I would say at sort of a national/policy level, if you're a policymaker, if you're a tribal leader, if you are somebody who is an influencer of the way that healthcare happens, invest in prevention. And there's lots of, Regina talks about this, we can invest in culturally based preventive programs that will offer more bang for their buck down the line than any treatments do today. So that's one. And if you're an individual, the things that were already shared, I love, but one that I'll add that people don't talk about as much, but really is scary to me, is smoking. So in all of our studies here in Minnesota, the Ojibwe adults I work with, 60% of our samples smoke cigarettes daily or more. That's a lot of people smoking. And if you have diabetes, the thing that's going to kill you is not drinking, but smoking cigarettes. The microvascular complications, I mean, it's absolutely scary. So please work on it. It's not our tradition, it's not our way, and there's lots of help out there to help you quit, and I'm evidence of that.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Melissa Walls, Director of the Great Lakes Hub for the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health. Miigwech, we appreciate your time tonight. Regina Brubacker-Carver, registered nurse and health educator with the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. Miigwech, thank you as well. And Dr. Sethu Reddy, the professor and chair of medicine at Central Michigan University. We do appreciate your time as well. Again, if you would like to see a recording of this panel, you can go to wcmu.org/diabetes. It should be up tomorrow. And I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Have a good evening.